What happens when entitlement collides with accountability? Prepare to witness a reckoning like no other as a spoiled heiress steps into the courtroom of a no-nonsense judge and gets a lesson she never saw coming. That morning, the Manhattan Supreme Court was packed. Murmurs rippled through the gallery as spectators leaned in, eager to witness the unfolding drama. This wasn't just another routine case, this was the trial everyone was talking about. At the center of it all stood Savannah Kensington, a wealthy socialite known for her reckless behavior and untouchable arrogance. But today, she wouldn't be partying in high-end clubs or flaunting her privilege. Instead, she was about to face Judge Nathaniel Carter, a man with an ironclad reputation for delivering justice without compromise. Feared by the entitled, respected by the righteous, Judge Carter had no patience for theatrics, and Savannah was about to learn that in his courtroom, the rules were different. Savannah, however, had never been held accountable for anything in her life. And today, she was about to learn that even wealth and status had their limits. Savannah Kensington arrived in her usual fashion late and completely indifferent. Dressed head to toe in designer couture, her oversized sunglasses shielding her from the commoners, she strutted into the courtroom as if it were a Met Gala event. Her nervous attorney, struggling to keep pace, trailed behind her, clearly wishing he could disappear into the polished wooden panels of the Manhattan Supreme Court. The room, accustomed to order and respect, fell into a stunned silence. All eyes were on her. Instead of taking her seat, Savannah paused dramatically in the center aisle, glancing around as if she expected applause. With an exasperated sigh, she motioned for her lawyer to move so she could set her monogrammed handbag on the bench beside her. She removed her sunglasses with an exaggerated flick of her wrist, her expression unreadable but the entitlement radiating off her was unmistakable. Then the atmosphere shifted. Judge Nathaniel Carter entered the room. The murmurs vanished in an instant, replaced by a thick, almost tangible respect. In his late 50s, Judge Carter was an imposing presence not because he was loud, but because he didn't need to be. His piercing gaze swept over the room before he settled into his chair, exuding an effortless authority that demanded compliance. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Savannah hesitated. She let out a dramatic sigh, barely concealing her irritation, before standing with the enthusiasm of a bored teenager. Her expression screamed, "Why am I even here?" Judge Carter remained unfazed. He adjusted his glasses, opened the thick case file in front of him, and began the proceedings without so much as a glance in her direction. Savannah's case should have been a straightforward slap on the wrist, a pile of unpaid parking tickets, and an incident of reckless driving that had almost injured a pedestrian. Any other defendant would have received a fine, a warning, and a few community service hours. But Savannah Kensington wasn't just any defendant. As Judge Carter outlined the charges, Savannah's body language shifted. She leaned back, arms crossed, eyes rolling, a picture-perfect display of defiance. Her attitude didn't go unnoticed. But instead of reprimanding her, Judge Carter continued with the same measured, deliberate tone. His calm professionalism didn't waver for a second. It was as if he were daring her to keep going. And Savannah, in all her arrogance, was about to take the bait. The tension in the courtroom thickened, a slow but steady pressure that even the most seasoned court regulars could feel. Veteran attorneys shifted in their seats. Court clerks stopped their quiet scribbling. The entire room seemed to lean in, sensing that something was about to happen. But Savannah Kensington, oblivious to the storm she was inviting, had no intention of backing down. She shifted in her seat, her irritation now impossible to hide. With each word Judge Carter spoke, her annoyance grew, manifesting in the rhythmic tapping of her manicured nails against the polished wooden table loud enough to earn a few side eyes. Her lawyer, already sweating under the pressure, leaned in and whispered something urgent. But Savannah barely acknowledged him, waving him off with a flick of her hand. The room, already hanging on a knife's edge, seemed to hold its collective breath. Then it happened. "Miss Kensington, please state your name for the record." Savannah didn't even look up. Instead, she exhaled dramatically and muttered, "Yeah, that's me." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the bailiff, who had seen it all, raised an eyebrow. Judge Carter remained calm, but his piercing gaze lingered on Savannah a moment longer than necessary. "Miss Kensington," he said, his voice even, "in this courtroom, we uphold a standard of respect. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." A smirk played at the corner of Savannah's lips, the kind of smirk only someone who had never faced real consequences could wear. She leaned back, casually twirling a strand of hair around her finger. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she said, her voice practically dripping with sarcasm. A collective gasp filled the room. The court reporter hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keys for just a fraction of a second. Savannah's lawyer covered his face with his hand, as though hoping to disappear into the chair, but Judge Carter, unmoved. "Miss Kensington," he repeated, his tone firm but devoid of anger, "do you understand the charges brought against you today?" Savannah rolled her eyes so hard it was a wonder she could still see straight. Then came the exaggerated sigh, the kind that screamed, "I could be anywhere but here." "Honestly, no," she said, tilting her head. "I mean, we're talking about parking tickets, and what? Someone got scared because I hit the gas a little too hard? This is a joke." The room went silent, no movement, no whispers. Just the sound of the clock ticking in the background. Judge Carter slowly closed the folder in front of him. He removed his glasses, setting them down with precise deliberation. For a brief moment, it felt like time itself had stopped. Then, he spoke. "Miss Kensington," his voice was steady, but the weight behind it was impossible to ignore. "I strongly suggest you think very carefully about what you say next." Even those who had entered the room disinterested now sat forward in their seats. But Savannah, still clueless, she shrugged. "What? It's true," she said, this time leaning forward as though making a point. "It's not like I hurt anyone. This whole thing is ridiculous." What Savannah failed to realize was that her words had just sealed her fate. Judge Carter's silence spoke louder than any outburst ever could, and the courtroom was about to witness a response they would never forget. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze locking onto Savannah. The room remained eerily silent, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Even her lawyer, who had been nervously shuffling papers, finally stopped to glance at the judge, sensing the shift in energy. "You believe this is ridiculous, Miss Kensington?" Judge Carter asked. His tone was steady, almost casual, but the authority in his voice was undeniable. Savannah scoffed. "Yeah, I do," she said, arms crossed. "I mean, come on, it's not like I robbed a bank or something. This is just overkill." She waved her hand dismissively, as if brushing off a trivial inconvenience. Judge Carter nodded slowly, folding his hands on the bench. His measured calmness only intensified the tension in the room, making the spectators inch forward in their seats. "I see," he said. "Let me clarify something for you, Miss Kensington. The charges against you include not only reckless driving, but also endangering a pedestrian's life. The law does not measure accountability by the size of the crime, but by its impact. Do you understand that?" Savannah rolled her eyes again, her impatience now almost theatrical. Sure, whatever you say." The words were soft, muttered under her breath, but in the dead silence of the courtroom, they rang loud and clear. Judge Carter's face remained composed, but there was a shift, a slight narrowing of his eyes, a pause that signaled something was about to change. "Miss Kensington," he continued, his voice still calm, "do you recall the incident from 2 weeks ago, the one that brought you here today?" Savannah shrugged, clearly bored. "Some guy stepped off the curb. I honked, he moved, end of story." Judge Carter raised an eyebrow. "End of story, you say?" "Yeah," she said, crossing her arms. "No harm, no foul." The room held its breath. What Savannah didn't know, what she couldn't possibly understand yet, was that Judge Carter was about to ensure that this was far from the end of the story. But Judge Carter wasn't finished. With calm precision, he reached for a document, flipping through it with deliberate care. Then, in a voice that commanded the entire room's attention, he spoke. "Let the record show," he said, his words firm and authoritative. Asterisk that the pedestrian in question, Mr. Henry Morales, was a 67-year-old retired schoolteacher. He was crossing the street legally when Miss Kensington accelerated toward him, causing him to stumble and suffer a wrist injury. He has since required medical attention and continues to experience ongoing pain. Savannah's smirk faltered. For the first time, a flicker of something uncertainty perhaps crossed her face. She cast a quick glance at her lawyer, who leaned in and whispered something urgently. But just like before, she waved him off. "I didn't hit him," she muttered. "He was fine." Judge Carter's sharp gaze landed back on her, unwavering. "Miss Kensington," he said evenly, "does that sound like no harm, no foul to you?" Savannah opened her mouth, ready to fire back another dismissive remark, but she never got the chance. Judge Carter's next words made it abundantly clear that her actions had far-reaching consequences she could no longer ignore. His voice remained calm, measured, yet every word carried undeniable weight. "Miss Kensington, your attitude toward this matter is concerning not simply because of the charges against you, but because of your refusal to acknowledge the seriousness of your actions." Savannah leaned back, feigning indifference. But the tension in the room had become palpable. "Look, I said I didn't hit him," she scoffed. "People are so dramatic these days." A ripple of gasps swept through the courtroom. Judge Carter tapped his pen lightly against the bench, pausing briefly before speaking. His next words would shatter whatever bravado Savannah had left. "Dramatic," he repeated, his tone cool and controlled. Then he delivered the final blow. "Would you like to hear from Mr. Morales himself, Miss Kensington? Because he's here today, in this courtroom." The air grew impossibly thick, the kind of silence that made even the most confident person uneasy. Savannah's facade wavered. Her eyes flickered toward the gallery, scanning the faces until they landed on one man in the second row. Mr. Morales, a 67-year-old man with an arm in a sling. His weathered face held no anger, no malice, just quiet disappointment. And somehow, that was so much worse. For the first time, Savannah Kensington had nothing to say. Savannah shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the confidence she had worn like armor now cracking at the edges. "I'm sure he's fine," she muttered, but the bravado from earlier was gone. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, his very presence commanding the room. "Miss Kensington," he said, his voice even but unmistakably firm, "your dismissal of this man's pain speaks volumes about your character. But this isn't just about him. It's about the precedent we set when individuals of privilege believe they are above accountability." The room was so silent that even the faint scratch of the court reporter's pen could be heard. All eyes were on Judge Carter now. Then, with a calm that belied the weight of his words, he said, "Since you seem unconcerned about the consequences of your actions, perhaps it's time you experience them firsthand." Savannah blinked, her earlier defiance crumbling. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice carrying a trace of real worry for the first time. Judge Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the bailiff, who promptly handed him a small stack of papers. The judge began reading aloud, detailing the fines, mandatory community service, and court-ordered sensitivity training Savannah would be required to complete. But it wasn't just the penalties that struck the hardest. It was the way he delivered them, each word weaving a deliberate, powerful message about privilege, empathy, and the responsibility that comes with living in a shared society. Savannah sat frozen, forced to listen as her actions were laid bare before her. Yet, what truly shook her and the entire courtroom was the unexpected final decision Judge Carter announced. The judge set the papers down, his gaze unwavering. The weight of his next words seemed to fill the room before they were even spoken. "Miss Kensington," he began, "I have reviewed the details of this case extensively. Given the severity of your actions and your blatant disregard for accountability, I am issuing a sentence that I believe will not only address the legal violations, but also provide you with a much-needed perspective." Savannah sat up straighter, her earlier flippancy now replaced by a flicker of unease. "Perspective," she echoed, her voice edged with growing disbelief. She had been expecting a fine, maybe some public service, but the way Judge Carter phrased it, this was going to be something far worse. Yes, Judge Carter said firmly. In addition to the fines and 200 hours of community service, you will spend the next 30 days volunteering at the Lower Manhattan Women's Shelter. You will work directly with individuals who have faced hardship often through no fault of their own. Perhaps then you'll understand the impact of carelessness and entitlement. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. This was not a standard sentence for a case like this, and the crowd's mixed reactions were palpable. Some nodded in quiet approval, while others exchanged incredulous glances. But the most telling reaction came from Savannah Kensington herself. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice rising in disbelief. "You want me to what? Hang out with homeless people?" "That's not my problem." Judge Carter's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped a degree colder. "Miss Kensington, it is precisely that mindset that landed you in this courtroom today. Your actions reflect a lack of understanding, a refusal to see how your choices affect those around you. This is not a punishment, it is an opportunity for growth. And let me be clear, failure to comply will result in a much harsher sentence." Her lawyer tugged at her sleeve, whispering urgently. But Savannah yanked her arm away, her face flushed with indignation. "This is insane. You can't force me to do this." Judge Carter raised a hand, his mere gesture silencing her outburst. "Miss Kensington," he said, his voice unshaken, "this court has the authority to enforce community service as part of your sentence. You will report to the shelter by 8 a.m. each morning, and your supervisor will provide weekly progress updates. Should you fail to cooperate, I will see you back in this courtroom under far less favorable circumstances." The room fell silent once more. Savannah's face burned with frustration, her fingers curling into fists against the table. But for once, she had no comeback. She simply sat there stunned, speechless, and very much alone. But the moment wasn't over yet. Judge Carter's final remarks would leave a lasting impression not just on Savannah, but on everyone in the room. He adjusted his glasses, his calm demeanor unshaken, despite Savannah's visible defiance. He let the silence stretch, ensuring that his next words would land with full force. "Miss Kensington," he began, his voice steady, "this courtroom does not exist to humiliate or belittle. It exists to uphold justice and, when possible, to teach. Your privilege has shielded you from consequences for far too long, and that has cost you the ability to empathize. This is not about punishment. It's about helping you reclaim your humanity." The courtroom held its collective breath. Savannah shifted uncomfortably, her gaze flickering toward the gallery, her bravado slipping further. She opened her mouth as if to speak but then hesitated. Judge Carter continued, his voice softer now, almost conversational. "Do you know what Mr. Morales said when asked about his feelings toward you?" Savannah shook her head, her eyes darting toward Mr. Morales, who still sat quietly in the second row. His expression hadn't changed, no anger, no resentment, just quiet disappointment. Judge Carter's next words landed like a hammer. He said, the judge paused for a moment before continuing, "I don't want her to suffer. I just want her to understand. Because if she doesn't, she keep hurting people, and one day, it might be something she can't undo." Savannah's face paled, her usual composure unraveling. For the first time, her defiance cracked, replaced by something else, discomfort, maybe even guilt. Judge Carter wasn't finished. "Mr. Morales, a man you nearly injured, has chosen grace over anger. He could have pressed for harsher penalties, but he asked for something different, an opportunity for you to learn. That's what this sentence represents." Savannah shifted in her chair, her confidence eroded. The room was so silent that every small sound, the shuffle of papers, the creak of a bench, the quiet intake of breath, felt amplified. Judge Carter delivered the final blow. "You will report to the Lower Manhattan Women's Shelter on Monday morning," he said. "There you'll meet women who have faced challenges you cannot begin to imagine. Some have lost everything. Some are rebuilding their lives from the ground up. You will listen to their stories, and in doing so, I hope you begin to understand the value of humility and accountability." Savannah gripped the edge of the table, her nails pressing into the polished wood. For the first time in her privileged, untouchable life, she had no words. Savannah looked as though she wanted to protest, her lips parting slightly, but the weight of the moment held her tongue. Her lawyer placed a hand on her arm, a silent warning to stay quiet. But even as Judge Carter's words sank in, Savannah's real transformation would only begin once she stepped outside the sheltered bubble of her privilege into a world she had never truly seen. Then, crack, the gavel struck, sharp and final. "This court is adjourned," Judge Carter announced, his voice firm and unwavering. He rose from his seat and exited the courtroom, leaving behind a silence thick with unspoken words. Yet the tension lingered, like the aftershock of a storm. Savannah remained seated, her expression a strange mix of disbelief and indignation. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering hurriedly, but she barely acknowledged him. The gallery began to empty, soft murmurs swelling as onlookers whispered about what they had just witnessed. Near the exit, Mr. Morales stood slowly, his slung arm a stark reminder of the moment that had brought them all here. As he passed Savannah, he glanced at her not with anger, not with resentment, but with a quiet, unwavering resolve. Savannah avoided his gaze, her eyes fixed on the polished wooden table before her. Outside the courthouse, the real circus awaited. A wall of reporters had already gathered, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward, eager to capture the fallout from the dramatic hearing. Savannah's name, once synonymous with luxury and excess, was now tangled in controversy, a courtroom spectacle that had captivated the public. "Miss Kensington, do you have any comment on today's sentencing?" A reporter called out. "Do you feel the sentence was fair? What are your thoughts on Judge Carter's decision?" For a moment, Savannah's usual arrogance resurfaced. "No comment," she snapped, pushing past the cameras and into the waiting black SUV. But the moment she was inside, the facade cracked. The doors shut, drowning out the reporters' voices, and Savannah sank back into the seat, her shoulders slumping. Reality was finally setting in. That evening, the story dominated headlines. Clips from the courtroom, Judge Carter's powerful words, Savannah's defiant smirk fading to unease, went viral. News anchors debated the sentence. Social media exploded, flooded with commentary and think pieces. Some praised Judge Carter, calling his ruling a rare moment of true accountability for the privileged. Others mocked Savannah, dissecting her attitude, her entitlement, her downfall. But no matter the opinion, one thing was clear. The world was watching, and for the first time in her life, Savannah Kensington had no control over the narrative. But the most poignant commentary came from Mr. Morales, who stood before a small cluster of reporters outside the courthouse. His voice was steady, his words simple, but their impact was anything but small. "I don't want her to fail," he said. "I just hope she learns. Because when we stop learning, we stop growing, and that's when we truly lose." The simplicity of his words struck a chord, resonating far beyond the courtroom. For Savannah, though, the lesson was only beginning. Monday loomed ahead, and with it a world far removed from designer handbags and luxury events. But what Savannah would soon discover was that real change doesn't come from being told. It comes from seeing, from doing, from feeling the weight of someone else's reality. Monday morning, Lower Manhattan Women's Shelter. The air was crisp, carrying a chill that settled deep in Savannah's chest. She stood outside the modest brick building, her oversized sunglasses shielding her hesitation. Through the glass doors, she could see a flurry of movement, volunteers hurrying about, voices mingling with the clatter of kitchen utensils. For the first time in a long while, Savannah felt something she wasn't used to. Out of place, with a deep breath, she stepped inside. The warmth of conversation and activity filled the air, but before she could process it, a woman in her 40s approached. She had a no-nonsense demeanor, but there was something welcoming in her gaze. "You must be Savannah," the woman said, her tone friendly but firm. "Welcome, let's get you started." At first, the hours crawled. Savannah was assigned to prepare meals, serve food, and clean up afterward. She kept her head down, her usual bravado stripped away. She didn't speak much. But as the day wore on, she started to notice things she hadn't before. The warm smiles of gratitude from the shelter's guests, the effortless camaraderie among the staff, the resilience in the stories she overheard. And for the first time, Savannah Kensington was listening. At lunch, one woman sat across from Savannah, a single mother of 3, her face etched with the kind of strength that only came from surviving hardship. Her voice was steady, but every word carried the weight of years of struggle. "You think you've got it all figured out," she said, her eyes meeting Savannah's. "But life has a way of teaching you what really matters." Savannah didn't respond right away. For once, she didn't have a quip, an excuse, or a deflection. She just listened. That night, as Savannah drove home, her thoughts were uncharacteristically quiet. The hum of the city blurred into the background. Her mind kept drifting back to the shelter, to the faces she had met, to the stories that wouldn't leave her alone. And then, back to Judge Carter. The next time she stood before him, she wasn't the same Savannah Kensington who had walked into that courtroom weeks ago. There was no arrogance, no eye rolls, no dismissive shrug. Just a quiet, more introspective version of herself. She took a breath, then spoke. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady, "for not giving up on me." Judge Carter nodded, his expression unreadable, but something in his eyes softened just slightly. "The real thanks will come when you take what you've learned and use it to make a difference." Savannah held onto those words as she stepped outside. The sun shone brightly overhead, the world as it had always been. But for Savannah Kensington, everything felt different. Because for the first time in her life, she wasn't just walking away from something, she was walking toward something better.